and vines for cold temperate climates. And I think I'll stay away from the tropics and subtropics today because that is so vast. It's a little bit easier to handle the temperate zone. So in 1978, I started Friends of the Tree Society, and my goal was to double the world's forest cover. And so I've been studying trees ever since. And when I got into medicinal plants, most people, when they think of medicinal plants, they say herbs, medicinal herbs. Herbs is actually a perennial herbaceous plant. And so there's a lot of our pharmacopoeia of our medicinal plants are trees, shrubs, or vines. And so here what I'm going to do is look at this list here, and let's see if I can put this up to the screen here. We have wildcrafting, or growing and wildcrafting medicinal plants in the Pacific Northwest. So this is a publication I put out quite some years back now, but it has a lot of information on growing and wildcrafting herbs. And I have in here a list of trees and shrubs, and it's pretty lengthy, too far to go through all of them. So I think I'll start with a couple of our main medicinal trees and shrubs and a bit of information on growing them. And then have you ask some questions too and see if you have some other ones in mind. So let's start with elderberry. Sambucus, it's a fairly large genus. They are growing wild on the Hawaiian Islands. There's European, there's Eastern US, Western US, Mexico. Have different varieties. And it's the berries and the flowers that we use medicinally. And the European elderberry, Sambucus, has gotten most of the press. And so that's the one most people know. Our native blue elderberry, Sambucus caerulea, is really good. I'm not recommending Sambucus racemosa, the red elderberry, at this time. It's just, it has definitely more toxic elements in than the other species. The bark, the leaf, the roots, all those parts with the phloem materials, that is all pretty toxic. The Native Americans used it as a emetic and purgative. In other words, if you take a good stiff dose of fresh elderberry bark, you will probably go at both ends, and it will be unpleasant. If you eat too many of the berries, you can even get upset. But the leaves and stems are much stronger, so they are used. It's interesting that Stephen Herod Buhner at this time, or in his book Herbal Antivirals, a lot of people are doing a lot of research on coronavirus, and what Buhner recommends in there is a sort of a rarer European species, Sambucus ebulus, using the leaves. Interesting. Maybe that's dried. I don't have the particulars, but I had somebody that has found where to get some of those leaves in Europe. She had to order it from somewhere like Romania. It's just not available in the United States. However, somebody should get some of that germplasm here and start growing that species. I don't know if I would assume probably somewhere is growing that species in the US, perhaps botanical gardens, but it would be really nice to get more of that particular germplasm in circulation. I personally am growing the European and the blue elderberry. They're very easy to grow from cuttings. Let me correct it. It is relatively easy to grow them from cuttings, but you really should be using rooting hormone on the cuttings. This is hardwood cuttings. Softwood cuttings probably would work too, but hardwood cuttings work quite well for me, dipped in some rooting solution before going into either the ground or a 1-gallon pot. And then they should root, most of them at any rate, and become, get growing that first year. The second year they get substantially sized. They don't like to be transplanted after about year 2 because of this. The crowns are just don't like being transplanted. So usually a 1-year-old crown is what you'll be getting from nurseries, or and that's from seedling grown. Let me go back. So they do grow a lot of elderberries from seeds in the nursery trade. However, they are recalcitrant, and generally they're soaked in sulfuric acid for an exact number of minutes. They might even do test runs before they do a big batch, so that they can exactly time that sulfuric acid. And that's really dangerous stuff to be handling. So most of us, our amateurs, should be staying away from the sulfuric acid treatment. Once they get going, they're precocious. Usually you'll be getting flowering and a little bit of production in the 3rd year even. And then from 4 years on, usually you have really good production, both flowers and berries. I find that if I harvest half of the flowers or a good chunk of the flowers, but leave the end flowers to pollinate, then I can get a good berry crop. So you can get a good berry crop and a good flower crop in the same year by judicious harvesting of the flowers. I think that's. Any other questions on that elderberries there from any of you? Okay, well let's go to our real important tree, the hawthorn. The hawthorn genus, Crataegus, is found temperate zone worldwide. There are, I think, somewhere around 100 species. In other words, it's a very big genus. And the flowers and the fruit are used medicinally, and the fruit is used as culinary as well. Hi, Mahala, nice to see you. So what species to use? Again, most of the press has gone to Crataegus monogyna, the European 1-seeded hawthorn. I don't like using the pink-flowered hawthorn. It's just too out of the ordinary compared to the white-flowered hawthorns. Almost all of them are white-flowered. So I mainly harvest from the Crataegus monogyna because that is what people know, and that's what the literature supports. And I consider it one of my better wildcrafting incomes. There's a big demand for both berry and flower. I have never had a problem selling what I had. In fact, we could sell large amounts more flowers. So if anybody has drying capacity in hawthorn flowers, hawthorn trees grows in the neighborhood, you could start your own hawthorn farm. There's a good sized market for a good price for both of those. Now Crataegus monogynous has gone invasive in quite a bit of the United States. And as a result, it's not very well liked by the native plant enthusiast. And there's a lot of them in Oregon. There's a lot of them in Washington. You can find them in Montana, on and on. It's also gone wild in New Zealand and in Australia. So it's again, one of those invasive plants that's gotten around, and that's that one particular European species. So as a result, I do not recommend planting that here in the Northwest. I recommend planting the native hawthorns. So let's look at the 2 main native hawthorns in the Northwest and compare them to the monogyna. One of my very favorites is Crataegus Douglasi, black hawthorn. They now split it up into 2 separate species, Douglasi and another one. They have a very dark black berry. the European hawthorn has a sort of a burgundy maroon colored berry. And so the darker the berry, generally the more anthocyanins, the more constituents. So I'm going to guess that the native Crataegus douglasi is actually going to have more constituents as a fruit than the European. The berries are quite a bit larger as well, so you can actually pick a lot. You can they don't cluster up as thick as the European, so it takes maybe a little bit longer to pick a pound of the native douglasi than it does the monogyna, but it still goes it goes pretty fast. And I charge extra money for the douglasi because it's a little more dear to get, harder to, so, and everybody can buy European hawthorn overseas, but they can't get that douglasi very often. And since it's a good quality and it also has more pulp to seed ratio. Monogyna, the seed takes up a big chunk of the fruit, like we might say half of the weight or whatever. But on the douglasi, it's much more pulpy, so there's going to be a lot more juice. You're going to get a higher pulp to seed ratio, which is good for your medicine as well. So now the Columbiana, Crataegus columbiana, or the Columbia hawthorn, has a red-orange fruit. So again, maybe not as dark as the monogyna, but again, I'm sure it's going to be, they're all good. There's no doubt there. The Columbiana has two advantages to it and one disadvantage. The advantage is that it fruits in large clusters and it flowers in large clusters. And so when it comes to picking flowers, the Columbiana might be the fastest of all. A tree just really bushes out with white flowers. And so you can really, it's really good flower harvest. The berries are also easy to get because of the clusters. So again, so it's prolific, and both of those are good to harvest. The disadvantage is that it has much larger thorns. The thorns are, a lot of times easily an inch long, and they can be used for sewing awls and things like that. They're quite, they're long daggers, and so it makes picking them just a little bit more hazardous than the regular hawthorns. Douglas has sort of an intermediate size thorn, and monogyna generally has the smallest of the thorns, but usually, oftentimes, more thickly set. The stems are more thickly set. But there's a lot of variation. I could go on, but I would say that the monogyna is a very plastic genus. That means it's very flexible. It has different sizes and shapes of leaves. To some extent, it has different amounts and sizes of thorns, and so anyway, it's a lot of variation. But so why am I going on and on about hawthorn? Because it's one of the main heart medicines. It's really good for strengthening the whole cardiovascular system, and anybody with almost any kind of heart disease or cardiovascular, vascular, venous system, when things aren't going right, the hawthorn long term will, I would again consult with a good herbalist, a really good someone that knows their stuff. But it's probably, for the most part, it's probably not have too many contraindications. Though who knows, there may be some drug contraindications. Okay, so flowers and fruit on the hawthorn. You can use them fresh to make your tinctures. You can cook you can extract the juice from them. You can cook the juice down a little bit to make a syrup. Very common to find in health food stores, hawthorn berry syrup. If I had a hawthorn berry syrup, I bet I could sell all I could get. If you go to any health, okay, maybe I'll stop there on hawthorn. Any questions on, no, I can't stop there. Hawthorn is one of the very best plants for making hedgerows in the Northwest and in the world. It's the most commonly used hedgerow plant in Europe. And that's because it's thorny, it's really stiff, and makes a very good fence for livestock or deer. So you can make live fences with hawthorn hedges, and then you can be busy harvesting them as well. So you can have a fence, a hedge, a screen, and really good income all at the same time. How nice is that? It's hawthorn trees you can grow from seed, and they that's commonly how they're propagated. And I usually buy them in from nurseries, 100 at a time, and it's a lot cheaper if you buy 100 plants. So if you want to put on the whole hedgerow, I think I'm currently paying under $2 a plant when I'm buying large quantities. Okay, so hawthorn. One near and dear to my heart, which I will just have to touch on because I was just harvesting and processing Devil's Club. Devil's Club is and last time in our last show, I actually showed a Devil's Club stick to you that I was cleaning out. So I did talk about that at some length in the last one there. So that is a medicinal bark as well. The Devil's Club. Just get the spines off. Be very careful. Say your prayers. Another something we just harvested the bark off of is red osier dogwood. Red osier dogwood bark has similar constituents to willow bark, aspen bark, and cottonwood bark. And you can also use the diminutive bunchberry. So bunchberry is a cornus, and red osier dogwood is a cornus. So all of those barks are used for inflammation and analgesic, pain killing. So, and to do those, for the red osier dogwood, I go to a red osier dogwood patch, and I like to pick large stems the size of my thumb, and smaller, but I like things that even twice the size of my thumb in diameter. And because then you have the thicker the stem, of course, the thicker the bark. And so it adds up a little quicker. If you have you should brush your stems on your red osier dogwood before you do the peeling. You should do that probably on almost everything. And what you're doing is you're cleaning it of lichens or surface things that are clinging on it. If it looks super clean, no problem. But if a lot of stems have bark on, lichens growing on the bark, and you want to dislodge that, you want to brush them. So I brush the bigger stems of the red osier dogwood, and then I get out my butter knife, my non-serrated butter knife, and I just peel down the stem, and then I clean up the cambium, and I'm left with a really nice, pretty stick. Now, that can be used for basketry. Dry it, offer it for sale. Usually you soak it just before you make the baskets. Same thing with willow. In the willow withy trade, when you're making basketry willow stuff, a lot of times the willows are sold with the bark on because it's trouble to take the bark off. But certain uses in certain baskets want the bark off, and those are called, and so when you take the bark off, it's a nice white or light colored wood, and they're called buffs. Those withies are called buffs. So if I had willow, red osier dogwood, like willow, is super easy to grow from cuttings. You just cut up pieces, maybe 2 feet in length on the red osier dogwood, and stick it in the ground, and it will grow. Same with willow, same with cottonwood. Aspen, I don't know that that's the case for aspen, perhaps. So all of those are easy to grow from cuttings. All of them you strip off the bark, and they all coppice. In other words, if I put a bunch of, let's say I want a hedgerow of red osier dogwood and willow, and I put them in the ground at, let's say, 3-foot spacing, those cuttings directly into the ground. They grow, and then I'm going to let them grow for maybe 3 or 4 years until the stems get relatively big, and then I'm going to cut them off about 6 inches above the ground, and they are going to resprout. And when they resprout, they sprout really thickly usually, and straight, because you're crowded in there, especially if this is a whole planting. Now, if it was actually a block rather than a hedgerow, they all want to race for the sun, and so they all get really tall, skinny, and are excellent for the basket tree, etc. Now, if I wanted to sell the bark medicinally, I would take all the bark off of those things, and then I would sell the resultant canes as buffs for a higher price than I would sell the canes that are with the bark on. So you can sort of have your cake and eat it too. You have 2 products from doing that. Okay, so that's Rhodosia dogwood, willow. Yesterday I was in the woods and I harvested some cascara. A tree had broken off. Maybe a couple, maybe a 2-inch diameter stems. And so we cut it up and brought it home. It has lichens growing on the bark, and so I'm going to have to peel that, brush the bark, possibly even use the knife a little bit to clean it up. And then I'll be scraping the bark off the cascara tree. That's a native tree, Cascara sagrada, Rhamnus persiana, nitrogen fixing, by the way. Permaculturists always love nitrogen fixing plants. So we're just like thrilled if we can get some nitrogen out of it to boot. So the bark is a well-known laxative. I don't know if people know that as much anymore, but in the old days, the Pacific Northwest used to ship out hundreds of tons of cascara bark dried to the world and to the U.S. for the laxative market. It was interesting that I was told that the biggest markets were Brazil and Germany for that, and so I thought that was interesting. The problem with cascara bark, as one of my herbal teachers once said, she doesn't want to take it. Be careful. It has to be aged for a year or heat treated before you use it to calm it down, because the laxative action can be way too extreme and they can get a lot of griping pain. So we have to be really careful with cascara. So it's a great laxative, but you should be knowing what your dosage rate is. You want to be using stuff that's been properly processed so that it will proceed well. But what I'm left with after I get the bark off of the cascara is I'm left with a very heavy wood. It's yellow in color. Too bad it fades a bit with time. Too bad, because it's a really gorgeous yellow color wood. And I suspect if you have a good sized trees of it, it might make a nice lumber if you could get it to dry without checking or anything. So anyway, but I use that wood for somewhere where I need a heavy wood. It could be a maul or that's mainly what I think of for hammering things. But it's a heavy, dense wood. It would have specific uses for a woodworker, and I just use them around the place. All these sticks that I peel, I use as garden stakes or bean poles, or depending on what the diameter and the length. I'm always trying to find uses for all those pieces because they're all cute, and I put a bunch of work into them. Okay, so there's another medicinal bark. Seems like that's a lot of medicinal barks. I'm looking at medicinal leaves here. I have a list of medicinal leaves. and of course not, some of these aren't used very much, but I'll mention a couple that are used quite a bit. The kinnikinick. Kinnikinick leaves are widely used. It's a trailing vine, you might say, shrub that beautiful red berries, edible berries, and lots of shiny evergreen leaves used for urinary tract infections and things like that. And so, but that is the actual leaves that are being used on that. Ginkgo leaves. Now there is a good one. My goodness. I am a big fan of ginkgos. I plant ginkgos wherever I go. I think I have a small yard. I think I have 8 ginkgos in it right now, but they're small. I'll have to move a few. Oh, by the way, is that Susan Evans from Wenatchee? Well, we don't know. Perhaps. Might be muted. So
I just unmuted her real quick. So not sure if she'll be able to respond or not.
Okay. Hi, Susan Evans. Are you in Wenatchee? Is this Susan from Wenatchee? Maybe she's, yeah. So we don't know. Now, ginkgo leaves are famous for as a memory herb and for helping the brain, mental functions. If I had a memory, if I could remember, I would take it every day. It hasn't caught up yet, obviously. So, but ginkgo leaves, I do have some over here, and I do make some tea occasionally, but I really should be looking at that more. So, ginkgo leaves probably helps people of all ages with mental acuity, but especially us old timers here. So, famous tree, super ancient tree. They're virtually unknown in the wild, or maybe unknown in the wild. The Chinese have been cultivating them for so many thousands of years as a temple tree, as a sacred tree. And where they came from originally, I mean, in terms of like the first wild stock, is just sort of, I think it's actually not known where. But ginkgo trees used to be a lot more common in the world. They covered a large part of the world once had ginkgo trees, and then it was finally just one little place left in China, and then the Chinese started growing it, and now we have it around the world again. I noticed last fall as I was driving outside of Seattle, a tree with a just gorgeous bright yellow color just stood out. Very striking. And I said, look at that. What's that? Oh, it's a ginkgo. Ginkgo leaves are probably best spotted. If you want to know where the ginkgos are in your town, you might drive around during the fall period when they're all bright yellow, and you could spot them from a much longer distance away. And if you were really technical, I suppose you could get a drone and just put your eyes on that drone and just fly around town and look for the ginkgos. And then you could go to those people and say, hey, could I have your ginkgo leaves? And they're going to say, absolutely not. I love my ginkgo. And you can't go up there and pick those leaves. But, however, there is a point where they're not needed on the tree anymore. So here's a matter of debate. When is the best time to pick ginkgo leaves for the medicinal quality? Most of the leaves you'll find in the market are yellow. They're yellow leaves, totally yellow. Some of my buyers want me to pick the leaves when they're mostly yellow, but some green. Some people want them when they're mostly green and some yellow. I don't think that I recall anybody asking me for just green leaves, earlier in the year. So you're waiting till the end of their growing season anyway. And one trick, they fall on the ground, and then if you go down there regularly, you can pick them up. You could maybe mow the grass and have a really nice place to pick up the leaves. But if the leaves lay on the ground very long at all, especially if it rains, they can start getting molds and various things on them. So you want to be able to pick them quickly. So what I if a tree is young and small, you could pick them. I just strip them just before they want to come off anyway. And when they're just some green and yellow, and I just strip them off the tree, and the buds are already fully formed, everything's fine, no problem. But if I have a really large tree, let's say 30, 40, 50, 100 feet tall, you say, oh my gosh, you can't get up there and strip the leaves. So here's a trick. Spread tarps underneath the tree, and then climb up the tree and shake it vigorously. And if you get it at the right timing, you can shake some fair amount of leaves loose. You might maybe do it twice a week apart or something. It is said that, or the folk lore is that if the ginkgo tree is growing, as leaves are turning yellow, and then all one night they'll all drop off. Now, of course, that's not true. But what they may be witnessing is that they were ready to come off, and then there was a frost, and that brought them all off. So if you're watching your timing, you might be able to put the tarps under there and let them fall on the tarp naturally, and instead of having to climb the tree. Some trees are harder to climb than others and are thicker. I mean, you get, anyway, you get the idea. So the trick is to get clean leaves and at the end of the season. The other use from a ginkgo tree is the nuts. The nuts are edible. In fact, I guess that a Japanese wedding wouldn't be complete without bowls of roasted ginkgo nuts. They're eaten, I believe that they should be roasted before eating rather than raw. And they look a lot like, you might say, a large plump pistachio nut, something along the lines of that. It's a very beige, kind of a oblong shell, and then with a big fat nut meat inside. So there's a food. I believe that there's also considered some medicinal qualities to the nut. Let me just look that up. So if you'll just bear with me for just for about 30 seconds, I'm going to get a book. Okay, so here it is. This is a book I pretty much recommend that everybody buy. So that includes all of you. It's called Fruit and Nuts. Very simple title, by Susanna Lyle. So this is a thick book. This is a heavy, big book. And it covers tropical, subtropical, temperate fruits and nuts. It has most everything you'd find in the marketplace. It doesn't have all the really strange things that I know about, but it has, a very large chunk of the fruits and nuts that you'll come across. Now, it talks about how to cultivate them, how to propagate them, when to harvest them, growing tips, all the kind of information you'd expect in a fruit and nut book. But the coolest thing about this book, the reason I'm recommending everybody buy it, is because it gives the medicinal uses of every one of those fruits and nuts that have known medicinal uses over the years. And so all those things I've mentioned today, like the most of everything I've mentioned, you're going to find in here, and it's medicinal uses of the bark, of the fruit, of the leaves, the nuts, or whatever, all the different parts of the tree. So this is a great medicinal resource. And it's anyway, so can't recommend the book highly enough. Great information, well worth the price to buy fruits and nuts. And so that's one of the places I go to look up the medicinal uses of fruits and nuts. And I thought I would look up ginkgo here. Let's see if I can get a quick fix on that. Ginkgo medicinal uses. Oh, listen, historically, the leaves were placed in books to repel bookworms. Now, I wonder if that would work for me. I'm a bookworm, but anyway, so that's interesting. Um, the wood is light and soft and also has insect repelling properties. So there's some medicinal there. Now, so here she talks about the ginkgo tincture, the ginkgo. She does not mention the nuts as far as medicinal, but they're delicious. The nuts may be toxic when raw, as I pointed out. Um, and anyway, there's a now here's the problem. There's always a problem. Huh? The problem with getting the nuts on the ginkgo tree is that the nuts are covered in a pulp, which is one of the more is rated right up there with durian, I believe, as far as a very repulsive smell. And so as the nuts fall down, which is about the same kind of similar time as the when I place tarps under a tree with nuts on it and leaves and get the leaves off and shake the tree, I'll also get nuts at the same time, double harvest. The pulp as it decomposes is very foul odored, and so people don't want them on the sidewalks, on the way into the house, anywhere near where the humans are. And so hence most of the ginkgo sold in the United States are male only. They selectively go for the males so that they don't get that smelly fruit, because Americans certainly don't want smelly fruit around and spoiling their lawns. So most of the ginkgos out there are male. So I think that with equal rights for feminine in this day and age is that we should be planting a lot more females out there too. So more female ginkgo trees away from the house where they can be smelly if they like. And then we'd have that additional food source. Okay. Plus, then the male trees get to have sex with the female trees. Just imagine how horrible it would be to be a city full of only male trees and no female trees around. That's what Americans do, kind of torture. Okay. Here's another a plant that's you're probably going to have a hard time growing in your garden, and that is Labrador tea, Ledum groenlandicum. Labrador tea. It grows in swamps next to fens and bogs, and so it has very specific habitat. It is found in Washington State, but I don't know if I've ever encountered it in the wild because I like to keep my feet dry. So generally speaking, you're going to want to wear maybe hip waders. I don't know that for sure. I just know that they really like their wet areas, and that the tea is used has been used in eastern United States, but back in times when people couldn't get their tea from England or India, Ceylon, whatever. So that was a trapper. In fact, its relative was called trapper's tea, which is Ledum glandulifera. Those two leaves were used as a tea substitute. They taste good. They have tannins. They sort of kind of do the same kind of thing as tea, and they might give you a little buzz. I remember I visited Native American. I was in a tribal area up in British Columbia years ago, and at a facility where the owner had an open house. She sort of served the local Native people food, beverages, just one of their spots. And she said that she sometimes had to kick teenagers out after they'd been, if they wanted to drink too much of the Labrador tea, they would come and really be sucking it up, and she'd have to cut them off because she could tell they were just after the high. So anyway, so Labrador tea is a medicinal tea as well. So let's see. Let's look at the the medicinal uses of blueberries and huckleberries, bilberries, whortleberries, lingonberries, all those vaccinium genus. There are a lot of vaccinium out there. And if you go to Costco, you can sometimes find these, they make these little mountains of ginkgo or turmeric or bilberry, European bilberry, and have it have big piles of it there, and with enticing come-ons like bilberries. Good for your eyesight. It's good for your cardiovascular system. It's good for diabetes. So the leaves are used generally in making these preparations, but it's not just the leaves. I actually harvest bilberry, European bilberry, here in Washington. It is actually a circumpolar species. In other words, it's found around the northern hemisphere, in the right habitats, in the mountains, cold places. And the European bilberries grows about, usually 1 to 2 feet tall. It's a small vaccinium. The berries are sort of a gray blue, and they're quite smaller than a blueberry or a huckleberry. They're small. They're extremely tasty. And the time to harvest is when the berries are ripe, and I clip the outer twigs. In other words, I'm just clipping, generally 4 inches to 6 inches of the stem, with stem, leaves, and berries all at the same time, all go into the bag, and that's what I ship to the buyer. That's what they make the medicine out of. You have to be really delicate with dealing with huckleberries, vaccinium. They're very easily bruised. I remember the first time I shipped a shipment of them off, I was just cutting and shoving them in my bags, and I was out in the woods, so I just really crammed the bags pretty full before I went back and then shipped them. And when they got there, a lot of the leaves were browned because they'd been bruised. And so I learned that you have to handle them very carefully. You don't want to pack very much in your bags. You want to keep things kind of loose. You don't want to rough them up. And plus, you want to keep the berries on the stems as much as possible. It's really great at the other end. When my buyer unpacks my European bilberry, he opens the package, and there is all these branches staring them in the face with the berries still on the stems for the most part. It's very beautiful. It's a beautiful product. And then he'll make his tincture out of that fresh, using all of that. And you end up with quite a sort of a purple blue tincture out of it. The berries are hopefully sufficient enough that you really get, you can actually get the berry flavor, but it's the leaves and the stem also contain the constituents. So where do you find European bilberry? Well, good luck, folks. I'm not telling you where mine are because they're really not, I haven't been able to find. I do find them from place to place, but I've never found like big fields where I could tell people where they are. I have to keep my patches secret. However, here's a tip for you, because a lot of people live in Western Washington, like Port Angeles and Poulsbo, as to my listeners here, and Evelyn. So we live here, and there's the red huckleberry, the tall red huckleberry, which is very common here around in the maritime Northwest, found in forests, generally growing on stumps and organic debris, old clear cuts that have now grown back, and or even young clear cuts. It turns out, when I did my vaccinium research, that the vaccinium are divided up into a number of subgroups. And the European bilberry has 2 other species in its subgroup. The red huckleberry, which is a very large bush. They can be up to 12, 15 feet tall. Very large sometimes. And the grouse whortleberry, which is Vaccinium scoparium. The grouse whortleberry is found in the high mountains and the Cascades. It's often found along trails. Any of you people that hike up there will know it. really quickly. It has small, very small pink berries, very tasty. And a hiker isn't going to fill up for supper on those things, but they're definitely going to fall on their knees various times along the trail and just gobble up a bunch of those little pink whortleberries. It turns out that the whortleberry and the myrtillus, or the European bilberry, are so closely related that they interbreed, and you can end up with hybrid swarms of them in the wild. So they're very, very similar. So if you're in the wild, you could also harvest that whortleberry if you didn't have the bilberry. But if you live in the lowlands where the red huckleberry is, and it's a much bigger bush, now there's one that we can be substituting. I don't know if anybody's done the lab work on this. I know they've done some lab work on it, and I would say confident in saying that it has good medicinal values, similar to the bilberry, but probably with some differences, minimal differences. So at any rate, that's something you can harvest, and you can eat a bunch of the red huckleberries when you're out there, because it won't take you that long to pick a couple of pounds or whatever you need of the leaf, flower, berry. The red huckleberry is sold for, I don't know what the price is per gallon these days. Does anybody out there know the price per gallon of red huckleberry? I imagine if Port Angeles would be an excellent spot to be finding a lot of red huckleberries. My brain wants to say something like $150 a gallon, but I think that's just too much. I can't imagine, I'm not sure what the price would be, but it's very high. And not many people buy it, but certain select restaurants there is a high-end market for red huckleberries. Of course, you could sell them to anybody. Anybody would buy them, or buy the jam. You can make them into value-added products. I was in a clear cut last fall harvesting fireweed flowers, or the tops, just at the sort of at the tail end of the flowering season for them. And I found myself in a clear cut that had grown up in a profusion of berries, but one of the most notable is that there were so many red huckleberry bushes that were loaded. I have never seen a better stand of red huckleberry. I mean, they were thick. The bushes were low enough you could pick them all from the ground. They were big berries. It was a good year. They had really loaded up. The berries had gotten fat, and it was like, oh, I wish I had time and the gear to do this. The problem was that there was a lot of blackcap raspberries, blackberries, and other thorny things. So you really had to, you want to wear your chaffs, what they call them, the chaff pants. You want to wear those cowboy leather gauntlet kind of things to wade around in there so you could go faster to get between the red huckleberry bushes. At any rate, there are people who in tough times, and tough times are coming, folks, in case you hadn't noticed. This is just unfortunately, I believe this is just a prelude to much worse to come. And in tough times, a lot more people pick berries than they do when times are good and they can get a good paying job and they don't have to work too hard. But berries are a good fallback. So I hope you're listening out there. Red huckleberries would be a good one, as well as those hawthorn berries, those elderberries. What other medicinal fruit can we talk about? Let's see, are we going to run out of time? Yes, we have 8 minutes left. We're just getting started. I've only covered a couple species here, but I'll mention aronia berry is touted for its health benefits. You can buy it in grocery stores now. Aronia berry concentrate or aronia berry juice, usually mixed with pears and other things. But it's a really dark berry. It's going to have a lot of anthocyanins, a lot of good medicinal compounds. And it's easy to grow. I highly recommend people planting aronia berries. Let's see. Juniper berries on a conifer. Juniper berries are great for parasite cleanse, and they're really good for UTIs. And if you look it up, you'll find things to do with kidneys and etc. So juniper berries, you have to be careful. I guess, on how much you eat, though I did read recently of somebody that was lost in the wilderness and was lost his glasses and was blind more or less, but he could recognize the juniper trees and he ate the berries, and that was how he survived for a period of time until he got rescued. So juniper berries, I guess, can be eaten maybe more than I thought. Oregon grapeberry. So here's a medicinal shrub that's near and dear to my heart. Oregon grape. The berries are kind of puckery. They're not too many people's taste straight off the bush, but if they're ripe, you can eat them straight off the bush, maybe an acquired taste. But as a culinary berry, they have few equals. The flavor of the jams, jellies on Oregon grape is just fabulous. It makes a fabulous Oregon grape wine. So it makes a really good wine. It makes really good culinary, and it's going to be, you just know it's going to have a lot of really good health benefits as well. The root of the Oregon grape is where I make money on selling the root. It's the root bark and the root that are medicinal, very good at strong antibacterial, one of our best antibacterials, and also used as a substitute for golden seal, similar constituents to golden seal. So it is our golden seal of the Northwest, and it's much cheaper. It's available pretty much everywhere in the Northwest. You shouldn't have to travel very far to find it. Some parts of the Columbia Basin might be a little tough, but almost every forested part of the Northwest will have Oregon grape and also parts of the shrub steppe. So really big shout out that Oregon grape's a great medicinal shrub. Another fruit which is the Chinese magnolia vine. Just have to say a few things about Schisandra, or the 5-flavor herb. It's a berry. It's from China. It has similar growing system to the hardy kiwi fruit. If you look up hardy kiwi fruit, it's similar soils, habitat, growing season, stature of the plant. You need a reasonable sized trellis, but not as big as the fuzzy kiwis. And so I'm amazed that there's not more people growing Schisandra chinensis in the Northwest. I'm amazed that I don't believe anybody has started a commercial planting yet. It's a high-priced berry. There's a lot of it used. We're importing it all from China. It's probably it is doable to grow it here. If you go to One Green World Nursery in Molalla in Portland, Oregon, they sell varieties, bred up varieties for high fruit production. It's a very ornamental vine, so it has it's ornamental in flower, it's ornamental in the winter, it's ornamental in fruit, bright scarlet hanging racemes of berries. So people should go out there and get a couple of Schisandras and plant them. I think you might need male and female, not sure on that, but Schisandra vines I'm highly recommending. Okay, there's a couple minutes left. Now there's time for questions, but not much. I gave you several opportunities in there. Anything else you want me to talk about?
And if you folks aren't familiar with how to unmute yourselves on a computer, it's going to be on the bottom left-hand corner. I can also unmute everyone or unmute you if needed. Just wave if you need help.
Yeah, we'll have to do that, or maybe do that a time or two during next time. We'll just try to work this in a little bit more.
I have a question about the ginkgos. Do they grow well from cuttings? Do you know?
I don't know. I don't know. I would suspect that, not since I haven't heard of it, I wouldn't suspect from hardwood cuttings, but a lot of things grow from softwood cuttings. So maybe softwood cuttings. I had to look that up. I don't know that. But seed is, if you're in the Chinese markets in Seattle, Vancouver, in a certain time, and they bring the seeds in fresh from China, or Japan and sell them at bulk at the market, and you can just grab a pound of those and plant them out. That's one of the easiest ways to get the seed, because once they dry, they probably don't want to germinate very well. Mini seeds like to be sown fresh, and I would suspect that of ginkgo, that you want to get the fresh seeds from the Asian markets. Or have somebody, if you know somebody in Seattle or Vancouver that could keep an eye on things, make friends with the Chinese grocers. Okay. Well, I hope that a bunch of people will be listening to this eventually. The world is full of medicinal trees and shrubs. Amazing how many plants that surround you are medicinal. I've just scratched the surface here, but I do have that long list in my guide here, and also that fruit and nuts book will really do you well. So there, we are surrounded by food and medicine wherever we go. And so you never have to worry about having medicine. You just have to worry that you know something. What you need to save your life may be growing outside your window. And if you don't know, it doesn't help. So if you want to save your life or somebody else, you should start learning the plants.
Thank you, Michael.